You know what they say about assumptions making an ass out of you and me? Well, turns out I was the only ass in this particular equation. The name's Ed Harlow, and if you're expecting some sob story about how life dealt me a bad hand, you can stop reading right now. Sure, I've got a busted right arm that screams like a banshee every time the weather changes, courtesy of a construction accident that ended my foreman career faster than you can say workers' compensation. But that's not what this story's about. This story's about my wife, Melissa, who could charm the paint off a barn and apparently had been charming a lot more than that. At 42, I thought I knew everything about the woman I'd been married to for 15 years. Turns out I didn't know jack shit. The morning everything started unraveling began like any other in our little coastal Maine town of Millbrook. I was in what Melissa generously called my studio. Really just the converted garage where I'd been dabbling in painting since the accident. Turns out, when you can't swing a hammer anymore, you find other things to do with your hands. Who knew? Melissa breezed through in that way she had, all flowing scarves and expensive perfume, her dark hair perfectly arranged even at 7 in the morning. She was the director of the Millbrook Gallery, which made her something of a local celebrity in our tourist-trapped town. Me? I was just the gimpy ex-construction guy who painted pictures that looked like a 5-year-old had a seizure with a brush. "I'll be late again tonight, Ed," she said, not even looking at my latest masterpiece, a seascape that looked more like a mudscape. "Big exhibition coming up. You know how it is." I knew how it was, all right. I'd been knowing how it was for the past 6 months, ever since she started having more late nights than a vampire. But being the trusting husband, I just nodded and went back to my painting. "Sure thing, honey. I'll just be here, creating art that would make Picasso weep." She laughed that tinkling laugh that used to make my heart skip. Now it just made my teeth ache. "You're getting better, Ed." Really. After she left in her pristine white BMW, paid for by gallery commissions, she always reminded me, I sat there staring at my canvas and thinking. Dangerous thing, thinking. Especially when you've got too much time on your hands and a wife who's been acting stranger than a cat in a doghouse. That's when I decided to take a little trip to my old friend Amazon. Not James Bond, like I told Mick later at the bar, but Amazon's got everything a suspicious husband might need, including GPS trackers that are smaller than a matchbox and easier to install than you'd think. The device arrived 2 days later in discreet packaging. I spent an hour that afternoon under Melissa's BMW, my bad arm screaming bloody murder, attaching the little black box to her undercarriage. If she was really working late at the gallery every night, the tracker would show that. If she wasn't, well, then we'd have ourselves a whole different conversation. That evening, Melissa announced she was having a girls' night with her friends Tara and Simone. Tara was one of those women who collected gossip like some people collect stamps, and Simone was her faithful sidekick who never had an original thought in her perfectly coiffed head. "Don't wait up," Melissa said, giving me a peck on the cheek that felt about as warm as a dead fish. "You know how we get when we start talking." Oh, I knew how they got all right. I'd heard them at their last girls' night, cackling like hyenas about whose husband was the biggest disappointment. Apparently, I'd ranked pretty high on that list. After she left, I fired up the tracking app on my phone and watched the little blue dot that represented my wife's car. For about an hour, it sat stationary at Rosario's, the upscale Italian place where the girls always went for their nights out. Then, around 9:30, the dot started moving. But it didn't head home. It didn't head to Tara's house or Simone's condo. It headed straight up the coast to Beacon Hill, where only one kind of person lived, the kind with more money than sense and houses bigger than most people's entire neighborhoods. The dot stopped at 1247 Ocean View Drive. I didn't need to look up the address. Everyone in Millbrook knew that house. It belonged to Julian Crane, art collector extraordinaire and the kind of man who wore ascots unironically. Julian, who drove a custom Porsche that cost more than I'd made in my last 3 years of construction work. Julian, who had been showing up at the gallery more and more frequently, always with some excuse about expanding his collection. I sat there staring at that little blue dot for 2 hours, watching it stay perfectly still at Julian's mansion while my world quietly fell apart. When it finally started moving again, around midnight, I closed the app and went to bed. I pretended to be asleep when Melissa slipped in at 12:45, reeking of wine and something else, something that smelled suspiciously like expensive men's cologne. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out exactly what kind of art my wife had been appreciating at Julian Crane's house. And if it wasn't the kind that hung on walls, well, let's just say I was about to become a very different kind of artist. The thing about betrayal is that once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. Like those optical illusions where once someone points out the hidden image, you can't unsee it. Melissa's affair with Julian wasn't hidden. It was just painted over with a thin coat of lies that I'd been too trusting to scrape away. Over the next week, I became a detective in my own marriage. The GPS tracker was just the beginning. I started paying attention to things I'd been blind to before, like how Melissa always showered immediately when she came home from her late nights, how she'd started buying new lingerie, the expensive kind from boutiques I'd never heard of, how she'd suddenly developed an interest in classical music, specifically the kind that Julian was always going on about at gallery openings. The smoking gun came on a Thursday afternoon. I was looking for aspirin in Melissa's purse, my arm was having one of its bad days, when my fingers closed around a small receipt. Saks Fifth Avenue. 1 bottle of men's cologne, Tom Ford Oud Wood, $250. Now, I may not be the sharpest tool in the shed, but I know my wife doesn't buy me cologne that costs more than our monthly grocery bill. Hell, she'd been buying me the same drugstore aftershave for Christmas for the past 5 years. That evening, I decided to conduct a little experiment. While Melissa was in the shower, I swapped her beloved Chanel perfume with a small sample bottle of Tom Ford Oud Wood that I'd borrowed from the department store earlier that day. If my suspicions were right, she'd notice immediately. The next morning, Melissa sprayed herself with what she thought was her usual perfume, took 1 whiff, and went white as a sheet. She stared at the bottle like it had grown fangs, then quickly grabbed a different perfume from her collection. "Everything okay, honey?" I asked innocently from the doorway. "Fine," she said, but her voice was tight. "Just, this perfume has gone bad or something." She avoided eye contact for the rest of the morning and left for work without her usual goodbye kiss. I knew then, with the kind of certainty that settles in your bones like arthritis, that my wife was cheating on me with Julian Crane. That afternoon, I drove to Murphy's Pub, the kind of dive bar where the beer was cheap, the lighting was dim, and my best friend Mick had been slinging drinks for the better part of 20 years. Mick was one of those guys who looked like he'd been carved out of a tree trunk, broad, solid, and completely reliable. He'd been my drinking buddy since high school, back when we both thought we'd conquer the world with our bare hands. "You look like someone pissed in your cornflakes," Mick said as I slumped onto my usual bar stool. "Let me guess. Melissa?" I told him everything. The GPS tracker, the cologne, the late nights, the whole sordid mess. Mick listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding and refilling my beer. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "So what are you going to do about it?" he finally asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to confront her, but she'll just deny it. You know how she is with words. She could convince a fish it doesn't need water." Mick leaned against the bar, his expression thoughtful. "You know what your problem is, Ed. You're thinking like a victim. Stop thinking about what she did to you and start thinking about what you can do to her." "What do you mean?" "I mean, these people, Melissa, Julian, all their fancy friends, they care about one thing above all else, their reputations, their image, their place in this little social hierarchy they've built." He grinned, and it wasn't a nice expression. "You want to hurt them? Don't go after their bodies, go after their world." That's when the idea started forming. Julian was hosting a massive gallery opening in 2 weeks, the biggest social event Millbrook had seen all year. It was supposed to be Melissa's big break, her chance to showcase some major new artist and cement her reputation as a serious curator. The whole town would be there, along with collectors and critics from Boston and New York. What if, I said slowly, instead of just exposing them, we made sure everyone saw exactly what kind of people they really are? Mick's grin widened. Now you're talking my language. What did you have in mind? We spent the next 2 hours planning. It wasn't going to be enough to just tell people about the affair. Anyone could make accusations. We needed proof. We needed to make them expose themselves in the most public, humiliating way possible. We needed to destroy not just their relationship, but their credibility, their social standing, everything they'd built their lives on. By the time I left Murphy's that night, I had a plan. It wasn't pretty and it wasn't nice, but it was thorough. Julian and Melissa wanted to play games behind my back. Fine. But they were about to learn that I'd been playing games a lot longer than they had, and I played for keeps. The first step was gathering evidence, real, undeniable proof that would stand up to scrutiny. The GPS tracker had shown me where they were meeting, but I needed more. I needed photographs, recordings, something that would make denial impossible. The next evening, when Melissa announced another girls' night, I was ready. I followed the blue dot on my phone as it made its familiar journey to Julian's mansion, but this time, I wasn't content to just watch from afar. I parked my truck a quarter-mile down the road and walked through the woods that bordered Julian's property. His house was one of those modern monstrosities that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually lived in a house, all glass and sharp angles, with windows that might as well have been billboards advertising everything that went on inside. I crouched in the tree line with a pair of binoculars I'd borrowed from my neighbor and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Around 10 o'clock, Julian and Melissa appeared in what I assumed was his bedroom, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the ocean. They were already half undressed, and what followed was a performance that would have made a porn star blush. I took pictures, lots of them. My phone's camera wasn't great in low light, but it was good enough to capture faces, positions, and the kind of intimate details that would leave no room for doubt. I felt sick watching it, but I forced myself to document everything. This wasn't about my feelings anymore. This was about ammunition. When they finished their little show, I made my way back to my truck and drove home. Melissa didn't get back until almost 2 a.m, and when she did, she slipped into bed like nothing had happened. She even had the audacity to cuddle up against me, probably still smelling like Julian's expensive cologne. But I wasn't the same man who'd gone to bed that morning. I was something new, something harder. I was a man with a plan and the tools to execute it. And Julian Crane and my cheating wife were about to find out what happened when you underestimated the gimpy ex-construction worker. The game was about to begin, and I intended to win. The thing about revenge is that it's like painting. You need to start with a solid foundation before you can create your masterpiece. My foundation was going to be Julian's precious Porsche, that cherry red symbol of everything he thought made him better than regular people like me. 3 days after my woodland photography session, I put the first phase of my plan into action. Julian's routine was as predictable as sunrise. Every Tuesday he went to his personal trainer at the Millbrook Athletic Club, leaving his car in the parking garage for exactly 90 minutes. That gave me a window of opportunity that even a gimpy ex-construction worker could work with. I'd spent Monday night preparing my supplies, a pack of bumper stickers that read "Cheater" in bright red letters, ordered from a novelty website, a bottle of fish sauce from the Asian grocery store in the next town over, and a small funnel that I'd picked up at the hardware store, telling the clerk it was for adding oil to my truck. Tuesday morning, I followed Julian to the athletic club, staying far enough back that he wouldn't notice my beat-up Ford in his rearview mirror. I watched him stride into the building in his designer workout clothes, probably planning to spend an hour lifting weights and telling himself he was God's gift to womankind. The parking garage was dimly lit and mostly empty, perfect for what I had in mind. I parked 2 spaces away from the Porsche and got out, trying to look casual despite the fact that my heart was hammering like a jackhammer. If anyone asked, I was just a guy looking for his car keys. The first part was easy. I slapped the cheater stickers on his rear bumper, his driver's side door, and his windshield, places where he'd see them, but not immediately. Then came the fun part. Julian's Porsche was the kind of car that cost more than most people's houses, with all the bells and whistles that money could buy, including an air conditioning system that drew fresh air through vents in the front grille. I popped the hood. Thankfully, Julian was too trusting to lock it, and located the air intake. The fish sauce went in slowly, one funnel full at a time. The smell was already making my eyes water, but I kept going until the entire bottle was empty. When Julian turned on his air conditioning, he was going to get a very special surprise. I was just closing the hood when I heard footsteps echoing through the garage. My blood turned to ice as I realized someone was coming, and from the sound of it, they were heading straight for the Porsche. I dropped to the ground and rolled under the car next to Julian's, my bad arm screaming in protest. The footsteps got closer and I held my breath, praying that whoever it was would just keep walking. Instead, they stopped right next to the Porsche. I could see a pair of expensive sneakers and the bottom of designer sweatpants. Julian. He was back early. "What the hell?" I heard him mutter, and I knew he'd spotted the stickers. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might look under the car and find me cowering there like a scared rabbit. But instead, he started peeling off the stickers, cursing under his breath about juvenile pranks and security cameras. I waited until I heard his car start and drive away before crawling out from under the Honda Civic. My clothes were dirty, my arm felt like someone had set it on fire, but I was grinning like an idiot. Phase 1 was complete. The real fun started about an hour later when my phone rang. It was Mick, calling from the bar. "You need to get down here right now," he said, barely containing his laughter. "Julian Crane just walked in, and he smells like he took a bath in a fish market." The whole place is staring at him. I drove to Murphy's as fast as my old truck would take me. When I walked in, Julian was sitting at the far end of the bar, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The smell hit me from 20 feet away, a nauseating combination of rotting fish and expensive cologne that made everyone in the place give him a wide berth. "I don't understand it," he was saying to Mick, who was doing his best to look sympathetic while clearly fighting back laughter. "I had the car detailed just last week." This smell came out of nowhere. "Maybe you ran over something," Mick suggested helpfully. "You know how these coastal roads can be. Lots of dead fish wash up after storms." I ordered a beer and sat a few stools down, close enough to enjoy the show but far enough away that Julian wouldn't recognize me. Not that he was likely to. In his world, I was just another invisible working-class guy beneath his notice. But I was about to change that. Phase 2 of my plan was already in motion, and it was going to make the fish sauce incident look like a love tap. That afternoon, I made a phone call to Mrs. Patricia Crane, Julian's wife of 23 years. I'd gotten her number from the phone book. Amazing how easy it is to find people when you actually try. I used a burner phone that Mick had picked up for me, and I disguised my voice by speaking in a higher pitch and adding a slight accent. "Mrs. Crane, this is a friend. I think there's something you should know about your husband." "Who is this?" she demanded, but I could hear the fear in her voice, the fear that every spouse has, deep down, that their partner might be capable of betrayal. "Someone who cares about the truth. Your husband has been having an affair with Melissa Harlow, the gallery director. They've been meeting at your house on Tuesday and Thursday nights when you're at your book club." There was a long silence. Then, "That's impossible. Julian would never. Check his phone records. Check his credit card statements. Or, better yet, come home early from book club this Thursday and see for yourself." I hung up before she could respond, but I knew the seed was planted. Patricia Crane was one of those society women who'd built their entire identity around being the perfect wife to a successful man. The thought that Julian might be cheating on her would eat at her like acid until she had to know the truth. Thursday evening came, and I was ready with my camera. I'd positioned myself in the woods again, watching Julian's house through my binoculars. Melissa's car was already in the driveway, and through the bedroom windows, I could see the familiar silhouettes beginning their sordid dance. At 8:30, exactly when Patricia's book club was supposed to end, a silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway. I watched Patricia Crane get out of her car and walk toward the house, her movements sharp and purposeful. She had her own key, of course, and she used it. What followed was better than any soap opera. Patricia's screams could probably be heard 3 houses away. Through the windows, I could see figures running around, grabbing clothes, shouting at each other. Melissa appeared at one point, half-dressed and gesticulating wildly, while Julian tried to play peacemaker between his wife and his mistress. It didn't work. Patricia stormed out of the house and drove away, but not before keying Julian's Porsche from bumper to bumper. The screech of metal on metal was music to my ears. Melissa left shortly after, looking disheveled and panicked. She drove straight home, where I was waiting in my studio pretending to work on a painting. "How was girls' night?" I asked innocently when she walked in. "Fine," she said, but her voice was shaky. "Just fine." She went straight to the shower, and I heard her crying through the bathroom door. But I felt no sympathy. This was just the beginning. I had bigger plans for Melissa and Julian, plans that would make tonight's drama look like a minor inconvenience. The gallery opening was still a week away, and I had a masterpiece to create. Not the kind that hung on walls, but the kind that destroyed lives and reputations with surgical precision. They wanted to play in the shadows? Fine. But I was about to drag them into the brightest spotlight I could find and show the whole world exactly what kind of people they really were. The beautiful thing about small towns is that gossip travels faster than wildfire and burns twice as hot. By Friday morning, half of Millbrook had heard about Patricia Crane's discovery, and the other half was about to find out in spectacular fashion. I'd spent Thursday night working on what I called my insurance policy, a painting that would serve as the centerpiece of my revenge. It was a caricature of Julian and Melissa, rendered in the most unflattering and explicit way my artistic skills could manage. Julian was depicted as a preening peacock with an oversized ego and undersized anatomy, while Melissa appeared as a grasping harpy with dollar signs for eyes. The background was filled with broken wedding rings, scattered money, and the ruins of other people's trust. It wasn't going to win any art prizes, but it would definitely win the prize for most memorable gallery piece of the year. The next phase of my plan required Mick's help, and thankfully, my best friend was as devious as he was loyal. Murphy's Pub had a small radio station in the back room, WMRP, the voice of Millbrook, that Mick used to broadcast local events and the occasional Irish folk song. It was a tiny operation with maybe 300 regular listeners, but in a town like Millbrook, that was enough to reach everyone who mattered. "You sure about this?" Mick asked as we set up the recording equipment Saturday evening. "Once we broadcast this, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure," I said, adjusting the microphone. "Melissa and Julian want to play games? Let's play games." The recording I'd made was from the gallery's Christmas party 6 months ago, when Melissa had gotten drunk on champagne and started gossiping with Tara and Simone about the artistic talents of various men in town. At the time, I'd thought she was just being silly. Now I realized she'd been talking about Julian the whole time, describing his bedroom skills in graphic detail, while her friends giggled and encouraged her. "And Julian," Melissa's voice came through the speakers, slurred but unmistakable. "God, Julian knows exactly what to do with his hands. He could make the Mona Lisa come alive, if you know what I mean." More giggling from her friends, and then Melissa's voice again. "Ed's sweet, but he's about as exciting as watching paint dry." Julian makes me feel like a real woman again. I'd edited the recording carefully, cutting out anything that might reveal the context, but leaving in all the juicy details. To anyone listening, it would sound like Melissa bragging about her affair to her friends. Mick looked at me with something like admiration. Remind me never to get on your bad side. We scheduled the recording to play during the Monday morning drive time show, when half the town would be listening on their way to work. Then we sat back and waited for the fireworks. They didn't disappoint. By Monday afternoon, my phone was ringing off the hook with people wanting to know if I'd heard what Melissa said on the radio. I played dumb, acting shocked and hurt, which wasn't entirely an act. Hearing my wife's voice describing her affair in such gleeful detail was like being punched in the gut with a fist made of broken glass. But the pain was worth it when I saw the results. Melissa came home that evening looking like she'd been hit by a truck. Her eyes were red from crying, and she kept checking her phone like she was expecting bad news. "People have been looking at me funny all day," she said, slumping into a chair at our kitchen table. "And Tara won't return my calls. Did something happen?" "I wouldn't know," I said, stirring the pasta sauce I'd been making for dinner. "I've been painting all day. You know how I get when I'm in the zone." She stared at me suspiciously, but I kept my expression neutral. Let her wonder. Let her worry. It was only going to get worse from here. The next day, I put Phase 3 into action. The gallery opening was scheduled for Saturday night, and I needed to make sure my special painting would be the star of the show. That meant breaking into the gallery and making a little substitution. Melissa had always been careless with her keys, leaving them on the kitchen counter where anyone could grab them. It was the work of 5 minutes to make copies at the hardware store, and another 5 minutes to return the originals before she noticed they were gone. Wednesday night, I waited until Melissa was asleep, then slipped out of the house with my painting wrapped in an old sheet. The gallery was dark and empty, its security system disabled by the code I'd watched Melissa enter a dozen times. I made my way to the main exhibition room, where the centerpiece painting, some abstract nonsense that was supposed to represent the duality of human nature, hung in a place of honor. I carefully removed the abstract piece and replaced it with my own work, making sure it was positioned exactly right under the spotlights. Then I hung the original painting in the storage room, where it would be safe but forgotten until after the opening. My masterpiece looked even better under the gallery lights than it had in my garage. Every unflattering detail was clearly visible, from Julian's ridiculous expression to Melissa's grasping claws. At the bottom, I'd signed it with a flourish. "The Truth About Art, E. Harlow." Saturday evening arrived with all the fanfare Melissa had been hoping for. She spent hours getting ready, trying on 3 different dresses before settling on a black number that probably cost more than my monthly disability check. She was nervous but excited, chattering about the important people who would be attending and how this could be her big break. "I just have a feeling that tonight is going to change everything," she said, applying her lipstick with the precision of a surgeon. She had no idea how right she was. I arrived at the gallery an hour after the opening began, when the crowd was at its thickest. I wore my best suit, the one I'd gotten married in, and carried a small digital recorder in my pocket. If I was going to destroy my wife's career, I wanted to capture every moment of it. The gallery was packed with Millbrook's social elite, along with a handful of critics and collectors from Boston. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes, sipping wine and making the kind of small talk that sounded important but meant nothing. I spotted Julian immediately. He was hard to miss in his purple velvet jacket and matching ascot. He was holding court near the bar, apparently recovered from his recent marital troubles. Melissa was across the room, talking animatedly to a woman with silver hair who I recognized as a critic from the Boston Globe. She looked radiant, confident, completely in her element. She had no idea that her world was about to come crashing down around her ears. The unveiling was scheduled for 9 o'clock, when Melissa would pull away the curtain covering the centerpiece painting and give a speech about the artist's vision. I positioned myself near the back of the room, close enough to see everything but far enough away that I could make a quick exit if necessary. "Ladies and gentlemen," Melissa announced, tapping her wine glass with a fork to get everyone's attention. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm thrilled to present a work that I believe captures the very essence of human passion and desire." She moved to the curtained painting, her hand on the rope that would reveal my masterpiece to the assembled crowd. "This piece speaks to the complexity of relationships, the way we hide our true selves behind masks of respectability. I present to you Hidden Desires." She pulled the curtain away with a flourish, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then someone gasped. Someone else started laughing, and then the room exploded into chaos. My painting was everything I'd hoped it would be under the gallery lights. Julian and Melissa's faces were clearly recognizable, rendered in excruciating and unflattering detail. There was no mistaking what they were doing or who they were supposed to be. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "Is that Julian Crane?" "And Melissa Harlow," someone else added. "The gallery director." Melissa stood frozen in front of the painting, her face cycling through confusion, horror, and rage. Julian had gone pale as milk and was trying to push through the crowd toward the exit. But the damage was done. Everyone in the room was staring at the painting, then at Melissa and Julian, then back at the painting. The critic from the Boston Globe was taking pictures with her phone, so were half a dozen other people. Within minutes, my masterpiece would be all over social media, tagged and shared and commented on by everyone who'd ever heard of the Millbrook Gallery. This isn't the right painting," Melissa stammered, but her voice was barely audible over the buzz of conversation that had erupted throughout the room. I slipped out of the gallery while the chaos was at its peak, but not before I heard Tara's voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Well, I always wondered what Melissa saw in that pompous ass. Now I guess we all know. The drive home was the sweetest 20 minutes of my life. I'd done it. I'd exposed them both in the most public, humiliating way possible. Their reputations were in ruins, their social standing destroyed, their carefully constructed world crumbling around them like a house of cards in a hurricane. But I wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning of the end for Julian Crane and my cheating wife. The final act was still to come, and it was going to be the most satisfying of all. Sunday morning dawned gray and stormy, which seemed appropriate for what was about to be the final chapter in my marriage to Melissa Harlow. She hadn't come home Saturday night, probably hiding out at Tara's place or maybe at some motel, trying to figure out how to salvage her destroyed reputation. But I knew she'd be back. People like Melissa always came back, if only to try to convince you that their version of reality was the real one. I spent the morning in my studio, putting the finishing touches on one last painting. This one was different from my revenge masterpiece. It was a self-portrait, showing me as I really was. Not the broken-down ex-construction worker that everyone saw, but the man who'd orchestrated the complete destruction of two people's lives without breaking a single law. I called it The Artist Revealed. Around noon, my phone started ringing. First it was my lawyer, Dave Hendricks, who'd heard about the gallery incident through his wife. "Ed, what the hell did you do?" he asked, but there was admiration in his voice along with the concern. "I told the truth," I said simply, "in artistic form." "Well, your artistic truth is about to make you a very wealthy single man. Melissa's been calling all morning, wanting to know about your assets. I told her what you told me to tell her, that you'd moved everything into a trust for your niece months ago." That had been Dave's idea, actually. Back when I'd first suspected the affair, he'd suggested protecting my assets by putting them in an irrevocable trust. Melissa would get the house, which had a mortgage bigger than the national debt, and her car payments. Everything else, including my disability settlement and my late father's life insurance money, was safely out of her reach. "What about the divorce papers?" I asked. "Filed them Friday, just like you wanted. She'll be served tomorrow morning." I have to say, Ed, I've never seen anyone plan a divorce quite like this. The second call was from Mick, who was practically cackling with glee. "You should see the local Facebook groups," he said. "Everyone's posting pictures of your painting. Someone even made it into a meme. And Julian, Christ, Ed, Julian tried to come into the bar last night." I had to throw him out because the other customers were threatening to lynch him. What about Melissa? Haven't seen her, but Tara was in here an hour ago, drunk as a skunk and telling everyone who'd listen about all the times Melissa bragged about her affair. Turns out your wife wasn't as discreet as she thought she was. That was the thing about Melissa's friends. They were loyal right up until the moment it became socially advantageous not to be. Now that she was a pariah, they were all rushing to distance themselves from her, sharing every secret she'd ever told them. The third call came at 2 o'clock, and it was the one I'd been waiting for. Ed? Melissa's voice was small and shaky, nothing like the confident woman who'd left for the gallery opening the night before. Can I come home? We need to talk. It's your house too, I said. For now. She arrived an hour later, looking like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and she was wearing the same dress from the gallery opening. She looked around the kitchen like she was seeing it for the first time, then sat down across from me at the table. How could you do this to me? She asked, and I could see her trying to summon up the old manipulation, the tears and accusations that had worked so well in the past. Do what? I asked mildly. Paint a picture? You know what you did. You humiliated me in front of everyone. You destroyed my career, my reputation, everything I worked for. I painted what I saw, I said. If you're humiliated, maybe it's because you did something humiliating. She stared at me like I was a stranger, which I suppose I was. The old Ed, the trusting husband who'd believed her lies and excuses, was gone. In his place sat a man who'd learned to play the game by her rules, and play it better than she ever had. I made a mistake, she said, switching tactics. I was confused, lonely. You've been so distant since your accident, so angry all the time. Julian was he made me feel special again. Special enough to spend our money on cologne for him? Special enough to lie to me every night for 6 months? Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered the sound of her voice on that recording, describing how boring I was compared to her lover. I want a divorce, she whispered. Already filed, I said, pulling out a copy of the papers Dave had prepared. You'll be served tomorrow, but I thought you might want to see them early. She read through the documents, her face getting paler with each page. A trust? Ed, you can't do this. I'm your wife. I'm entitled to half of everything. You're entitled to half of what we accumulated during our marriage, I corrected. The house, which has negative equity thanks to your spending habits. Your car, which you're still making payments on. The credit card debt, which is considerable. As for my inheritance and disability settlement, well, those went into the trust 6 months ago. Amazing how much you can accomplish when your wife is too busy screwing around to pay attention to the paperwork she's signing. The look on her face was worth every moment of pain I'd endured since discovering her affair. She'd played me for a fool, but I'd been playing a longer game all along. You bastard, she said, but there was no heat in it, just the recognition that she'd been outmaneuvered by someone she'd thought was beneath her notice. Probably, I agreed. But I'm a bastard who's about to be very happily divorced. She left that evening, taking only what she could fit in her BMW. I watched from the window as she loaded her suitcases, thinking about the 15 years we'd spent together and feeling nothing but relief that it was finally over. But Julian Crane wasn't ready to let things end quietly. Tuesday night he showed up at my front door, looking like a man who'd lost everything, which, come to think of it, he had. Patricia had filed for divorce and frozen all their joint accounts. His art collection was being liquidated to pay for his wife's lawyer, and his reputation in the art world was about as valuable as a $3 bill. You son of a bitch, he snarled when I opened the door. You destroyed my life. I painted a picture, I said, echoing what I'd told Melissa. If your life was destroyed by the truth, maybe you should have lived a different life. He tried to push past me into the house, but I was ready for him. My right arm might have been damaged, but my left was just fine, and I'd spent 15 years in construction learning how to handle men who thought they were tougher than they actually were. I grabbed Julian by his expensive shirt and dragged him back onto the porch, where my neighbors could see everything that happened next. Mrs. Patterson from next door was walking her dog, and the Kowalski kids were playing in their front yard. Perfect witnesses for what was about to unfold. "You want to settle this like men?" I asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Fine. But we do it right here, in front of God and everybody, so there's no question about who started what." Julian swung at me, a wild haymaker that telegraphed itself from next week. I ducked easily and let his momentum carry him into the porch railing. He bounced off and came at me again, and this time I didn't bother dodging. My left fist caught him square in the nose, and I felt the cartilage crunch under my knuckles. He went down hard, blood streaming down his face, his expensive clothes torn and dirty. "Stay down," I advised him. "You're not as tough as you think you are, and I'm not as broken as you assumed." He tried to get up once more, and I put him back down with a knee to his solar plexus that left him gasping like a landed fish. By then, half the neighborhood had come out to watch, and someone had called the police. Detective Nash arrived just as Julian was trying to crawl away, still wheezing and bleeding. Nash was an old-school cop who'd grown up in Millbrook back when it was a working-class town instead of a tourist destination. He took one look at the scene and shook his head. "Let me guess," he said. "Mr. Crane here thought he could intimidate the local yokel, and it didn't work out the way he planned." "Something like that," I said, flexing my left hand. My knuckles were scraped and swollen, but it was a good kind of pain. Nash helped Julian to his feet and looked him over with professional disinterest. "You want to press charges, Mr. Crane? Because I've got about a dozen witnesses who saw you throw the first punch, and Mr. Harlow here was just defending his property." Julian looked around at the crowd of neighbors, all of whom were staring at him with expressions ranging from disgust to amusement. He was a beaten man in every sense of the word, and he knew it. "No," he mumbled through his broken nose. "No charges." "Smart choice," Nash said. "Now I suggest you get in your fancy car and drive away. And maybe think twice before you come back here looking for trouble." Julian stumbled to his Porsche, the same car I'd filled with fish sauce what felt like a lifetime ago, and drove away. I never saw him again. Word around town was that he'd moved to Florida, where nobody knew about his affair or his humiliation at the hands of a gimpy ex-construction worker. Melissa lasted another month before she gave up and moved to Boston, where she got a job at a small gallery in the Back Bay. I heard through the grapevine that she was dating a married investment banker, because apparently some people never learn. As for me, I kept painting. My revenge masterpiece had made me something of a local celebrity, and tourists started coming by to see the studio where the Millbrook scandal had been created. I sold a few pieces, nothing fancy, but enough to supplement my disability payments and keep me in paint and canvas. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting in my studio working on a seascape that actually looked like the ocean when Mick knocked on the door. "You've got a visitor," he said, grinning like he knew something I didn't. Behind him stood a woman about my age, with graying brown hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She was wearing paint-stained jeans and a Red Sox t-shirt, and she looked like the kind of person who'd rather be outdoors than stuck in some fancy gallery. "Mr. Harlow, I'm Sarah Chen from the Portland Museum of Art. I was wondering if you'd be interested in showing some of your work in our upcoming exhibition on art as social commentary." I looked at the painting I'd been working on, then at Sarah's honest face, then at Mick, who was practically bouncing with excitement. "What kind of exhibition?" I asked. "Well," she said, stepping into the studio and looking around at my paintings with genuine interest, "we're calling it Truth and Consequences, When Art Meets Life. Your piece from the Millbrook Gallery has generated quite a bit of discussion in academic circles. We think it represents a new form of personal narrative art. I thought about Melissa and Julian, probably still dealing with the fallout from their choices. I thought about the 15 years I'd wasted on a woman who'd never really seen me as anything more than a convenient husband. And I thought about the man I'd become, not the victim I'd been, but the artist who'd learned to paint his truth in colors that couldn't be ignored. "When do you need an answer?" I asked. "Take your time," Sarah said, "but I hope you'll consider it. The world needs more artists who aren't afraid to show people exactly who they really are." After she left, I stood in my studio, looking at all the paintings I'd created since my world fell apart. They weren't masterpieces in the classical sense, but they were honest. They showed the world as I'd experienced it, messy, painful, beautiful, and real. I picked up my brush and added one final stroke to the seascape, a small sailboat on the horizon heading toward calmer waters. Then I signed it with the confidence of a man who'd learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and telling the truth. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking up, and for the first time in months, I could see clear sky on the horizon. Horizon, 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 horizon.